The sound of the typewriter was usually a rhythm of bureaucracy, a steady, mechanical heartbeat of the supreme headquarters. But on this specific afternoon in late December 1944, the keys were striking the paper with the violence of a weapon. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man famous for his infectious grin and supernatural patience, was not smiling. His face was a mask of dark, uncharacteristic rage. The air in the room was thick with smoke and terror. His aides stood frozen against the walls, terrified to breathe too loudly. Eisenhower was done negotiating. For 2 years, he had mediated, flattered, and compromised to keep the fragile alliance between the United States and Great Britain alive. He had swallowed insults and ignored insubordination. But the document sitting in the carriage of his typewriter wasn't a battle plan or a logistical report. It was an ultimatum. It was a letter to the combined chiefs of staff that would demand the immediate removal of Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. Eisenhower was preparing to fire Britain's greatest war hero, even if it tore the Allied command structure apart. The compromise was over. The general had finally snapped. To understand why the Supreme Commander was ready to destroy his most famous subordinate, we have to look at the map of Europe in the autumn of 1944. On paper, the Allies were winning. They had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were racing toward the German border. But beneath the celebratory headlines, the Allied High Command was rotting. From the inside out, it was a clash of two incompatible philosophies and two massive egos. On one side was the American broad front strategy, favored by Eisenhower. It was a slow, methodical steamroller designed to stretch the German defenses until they snapped, utilizing the sheer industrial might of the United States. On the other side was Montgomery's narrow front doctrine, a lightning strike, a single dagger thrust into the heart of Germany. Led, of course, by Montgomery himself. The tension wasn't just strategic, it was tribal. The British, exhausted by 5 years of war and bankrupt of manpower, needed a quick end. They looked at the Americans with a mix of gratitude and condescension, viewing generals like Patton and Bradley as aggressive cowboys, lacking the sophistication of the British officer class. Eisenhower sat in the middle of this geopolitical pressure cooker. He wasn't just fighting Hitler. He was managing a toxic marriage between a fading empire and a rising superpower. Every decision was scrutinized by Churchill in London and Roosevelt in Washington. But as the autumn rains turned the battlefields to mud, the friction between Ike and Monty began to spark. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery lived in a reality constructed entirely by his own ego. To the British public, he was the victor of El Alamein, the man who had beaten Rommel, the soldier saint who didn't drink, didn't smoke, and never lost. He wore his black beret like a crown and treated the battlefield as his personal chessboard. In Montgomery's mind, he was the only true professional in a theater crowded with amateurs. He viewed Eisenhower not as a superior officer, but as a board chairman, a nice administrator who should handle the politics and leave the actual fighting to the men who knew how to win. This was the grand illusion of 1944. Montgomery believed he was indispensable. He believed that the Americans, with their raw troops and chaotic energy, would be lost without his guiding hand. He treated General Bradley like a junior cadet and openly mocked Patton's intelligence. This hubris wasn't private, it was broadcast. In staff meetings, Montgomery would lecture Eisenhower, tapping maps with his cane, explaining simple concepts as if speaking to a slow child. He genuinely believed that the Allied victory depended entirely on his genius. He was convinced that if Eisenhower would just give him all the fuel, all the trucks, and all the reserves, he could end the war by Christmas. He was blindingly confident, unaware that he was walking toward a precipice that would shatter his reputation. The first massive crack in Montgomery's armor of invincibility appeared in the Netherlands. It was Operation Market Garden, the physical manifestation of his narrow front obsession. He demanded priority, and he got it. On September 17, 1944, the largest airborne armada in history took to the skies. The objective was a 64-mile corridor of highway leading to a single bridge over the lower Rhine at Arnhem. The data from this week tells a story of catastrophic overreach. The British 1st Airborne Division, the elite of the King's Army, dropped into Arnhem with 10,005 men. They were tasked with holding the bridge for 2 days until the armor arrived. They held for 9. When the order to withdraw was finally given on September 25th, only 2,163 men made it back across the river. Nearly 8,000 soldiers were killed or captured in a single week of fighting. Despite the carnage, Montgomery refused to call it a failure. In his reports to London, he described the operation as 90% successful, a statistical manipulation that enraged the American commanders who had diverted their own supplies to support him. The pencil thrust had snapped. The bridge was a bridge too far. The 64-mile corridor became a graveyard. Yet Montgomery did not humble himself. Instead, he blamed the Polish paratroopers. He blamed the weather. And most dangerously, he began to blame the American logistical system for not moving fast enough to save a plan that was doomed from the start. If Arnhem was a tactical failure, the situation at Antwerp was a strategic crime born of negligence. The port of Antwerp, one of the largest in Europe, had been captured intact by the British 11th Armored Division on September 4th, 1944. It was the golden ticket to solving the Allied supply crisis. But a port is useless if ships cannot reach the docks. The Scheldt estuary, the 60-mile waterway leading to the open sea, was still heavily mined and garrisoned by the German 15th Army. The math was brutal and unforgiving. The Allied armies required 85,000 tons of supplies every single day to maintain the offensive. By October, they were receiving a fraction of this, with fuel having to be trucked 300 miles from the beaches of Normandy. Every gallon of gas used to drive a truck was a gallon not used in a tank. Montgomery had been ordered to clear the Scheldt immediately. Instead, he ignored the order to focus his resources on the disaster at Arnhem. The result was that the Scheldt estuary was not cleared until November 8, 1944, a delay of 2 critical months. During those 60 days, the American advances under Patton and Hodges ground to a halt, their tanks sitting dry on the roadside. Montgomery had effectively choked the Allied war engine to feed his own vanity project. Yet, in his communications with Eisenhower, he had the audacity to complain that his armies were undersupplied, blaming the very logistical crisis he had created. The tension finally boiled over during the Battle of the Bulge, when the Germans launched their desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes on December 16th. Eisenhower made a pragmatic decision. He temporarily transferred command of 2 American armies, the 1st and the 9th, to Montgomery, simply because the German wedge had cut their communications with General Bradley. Montgomery saw this not as an emergency measure, but as validation. On January 7, 1945, he held a press conference that would go down in infamy. He strutted before the reporters, describing the battle as a cleanup operation where he had tidied up the mess created by the Americans. He implied that he had saved the demoralized U.S. troops from certain destruction. The hard data exposes this narrative as a complete fabrication. At the height of the battle, 600,000 American troops were engaged in the freezing forests of the Ardennes. The British contribution, while helpful on the northern flank, was structurally minor. The casualty reports paint the starkest picture of who bore the burden. The United States Army suffered over 89,000 casualties, stopping Hitler's last gamble. The British forces under Montgomery suffered roughly 1,400. Yet, standing before the microphones, Montgomery spoke as if he were the shepherd rescuing lost sheep. It was a distortion of reality so profound that it didn't just annoy the Americans. It questioned their courage. The transcript of the press conference reached Eisenhower's desk the next morning. The reaction was volcanic. General Bradley, usually stoic, threatened to resign rather than serve under Montgomery again. Patton was apoplectic. Eisenhower, the man who had kept the peace for so long, realized that the toxicity of Montgomery's ego had finally outweighed his utility as a commander. Eisenhower sat at his desk in the Trianon Palace Hotel and began to draft a message to General George Marshall in Washington and Prime Minister Churchill in London. This wasn't a complaint. It was a termination notice. The text was sharp, cold, and final. He wrote that the differences between himself and Montgomery were now unbridgeable. He laid out the ultimatum clearly. I am now convinced that the present command setup is unworkable. It appears that the Prime Minister and I have to decide between him and me. There was no ambiguity. Eisenhower was putting his own stars on the table. He was forcing the British government to choose, keep their national hero and lose the Supreme Commander and the American alliance, or fire Montgomery and keep the war effort alive. He folded the draft, ready to send it. The verbal revelation was silence no longer. It was a scream of bureaucratic execution. The crisis was intercepted by a single man, Major General Freddie de Guingand, Montgomery's chief of staff. De Guingand was the lubricant that kept the machine from seizing. He was liked by the Americans and trusted by the British. When he saw the draft of Eisenhower's letter and heard the rage in Bedell Smith's voice, he realized the catastrophe that was about to unfold. He flew immediately to Montgomery's tactical headquarters in Zonhoven. The weather was abysmal, a reflection of the political storm. When he arrived, Montgomery was in high spirits, still riding the high of his press conference. De Guingand didn't waste time. He walked into the caravan and dropped the bomb. He told Montgomery, explicitly and brutally, that Eisenhower was about to fire him. Montgomery laughed it off initially. "Ike can't fire me," he said. "I'm the senior British commander." De Guingand looked him in the eye and delivered the reality check. "Sir, you are wrong. The Americans have the men, the money, and the tanks. London will back Ike. You have no friends left in Washington, and you have very few left in London. If you don't apologize, you are finished." The color drained from the field marshal's face. The illusion of power evaporated instantly. Why did Montgomery push it this far? Why did a man of such intelligence and experience almost sabotage the victory he had fought for? The answer lies not in strategy, but in deep-seated psychological insecurity. Montgomery was the personification of the British Empire in 1944. Proud, storied, but undeniably fading. He looked at the American war machine, The endless lines of Sherman tanks, the Liberty ships, the millions of fresh-faced GIs. And he saw the future. He realized that Britain was becoming the junior partner. His arrogance, his narrow front insistence, and his belittling of American generals were all defense mechanisms. He was trying to assert control over a war that had grown too big for Britain to lead alone. By claiming he saved the Americans in the Bulge, he wasn't just bragging. He was trying to prove that British professionalism was still superior to American mass production. It was a desperate attempt to maintain relevance in a world that was shifting under his feet. He feared that if he wasn't the master of the battlefield, he would just be another general in Eisenhower's massive army. The realization broke Montgomery. For the first time in the war, the Spartan general was terrified. He realized that he wasn't fighting the Germans anymore. He was fighting for his career. He sat down and wrote the most difficult letter of his life. It was a total, abject surrender. He wrote to Eisenhower, "Dear Ike, I am distressed that my press conference has caused you such trouble. I would never do anything to hurt you or the alliance. I am your very devoted subordinate." He signed it and handed it to de Guignand to fly back to SHAEF. When Eisenhower read the note, the anger didn't vanish, but the crisis was defused. Ike, ever the pragmatist, accepted the apology. He tore up the ultimatum he had drafted to Marshal. Montgomery kept his command. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. The lion had been forced to roll over. Montgomery would never again openly challenge Eisenhower's authority. The apology saved Montgomery's job, but it cost him his strategic influence. From January 1945 until the end of the war, Eisenhower's broad front strategy reigned supreme. The priority shifted to the American armies. It was the U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies that vaulted across the Rhine at Remagen, not Monty's forces in the north. When the final drive into Germany began, Montgomery was relegated to a supporting role, protecting the northern flank while the Americans drove toward the Elbe. The special relationship between the U.S. and U.K. survived, but the hierarchy was now set in stone. The era of British dominance was over. The American century had begun on the battlefield. Eisenhower never fully trusted Montgomery again. The friendship was gone, replaced by a cold, functional professional courtesy. The apology letter was filed away, a paper monument to the moment the balance of power tipped forever. History remembers the parades, the ticker tape, and the newsreels of smiling generals shaking hands over the ruins of the Third Reich. But the true history of the Allied victory is far more fragile. The war against Hitler was nearly lost, not by German panzers, but by the collision of Allied egos. Dwight D. Eisenhower's greatest victory wasn't D-Day or the crossing of the Rhine. It was the silent, frustrating battle he fought in his own headquarters. He defeated the enemy without, by first conquering the pride within. On that cold day in January, simply by typing a letter he never sent, Eisenhower proved that while battles are won by logistics and bullets, wars are managed by men. And sometimes, the hardest command to give is the one that tells a hero to shut up.